I never thought I'd feel this kind of betrayal so close to home, especially from the one person I trusted more than anyone else. My wife, Julia, knew she was pregnant. She had told me just a few days ago, her voice trembling with hope and fear wrapped in one fragile moment. That news should have been the happiest thing in my life, yet now it feels like the beginning of a nightmare I can't wake from. Tonight, I'm standing outside a hotel room on the edge of losing everything. Julia isn't at home resting, as she should be. Instead, she's inside this room with Mark, her male best friend. Or at least, that's what I tell myself to make sense of it. But deep down, the pit in my stomach whispers another story. How could she spend the night here, knowing there's a life growing inside her? Why didn't she call me? Why did she choose to be somewhere that feels so wrong, so secretive? I'm gripping my phone, scrolling through messages she never sent, replaying the ones she did. There's no explanation, no apology, just silence and the unbearable weight of suspicion. This isn't just about the hotel room or the night. It's about everything we promised to each other. The trust, the loyalty, the future we were supposed to build. I'm caught between wanting to confront her and needing to understand what's really going on. But one thing's clear. Whatever this is, it's more complicated than I ever imagined. And tonight, my world is about to shatter. Julie and I have been together for 6 years now, 5 of them married. When I first met her, she was the kind of woman who lit up a room with her laughter, the kind who made you believe that everything in the world could be okay. We met in college, in a creative writing class, ironically enough. I was shy, awkward, and barely knew how to express myself beyond words on paper. She was the opposite, bold, radiant, fiercely independent. Somehow she saw something in me I hadn't seen in myself, and that drew us together. Mark entered the picture much later, about 2 years ago. Julia met him at work. He was a graphic designer, charming, quick-witted, and one of those people who can make friends anywhere. I'll admit I liked him at first. Mark seemed like a good guy, the kind who could support Julia's creative ambitions when I was too caught up in my own world. They became inseparable as friends, sharing jokes, late-night brainstorming sessions, even weekend hikes. I never thought to worry about their relationship because I trusted Julia. She told me countless times that Mark was like a brother to her, and I believed her. But maybe that was my mistake. Trusting someone blindly doesn't mean you won't get hurt. Julia has always been a fighter. She had a rough childhood. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she learned early how to stand on her own 2 feet. That's part of why I admired her so much. She never let her past define her. When we got married, we dreamed of building a life full of love, trust, and family. The pregnancy was the final piece of that dream, something we both wanted desperately. I saw it in her eyes when she told me, a mix of hope and anxiety. We were both terrified but ready. Mark was there for her during the early weeks of morning sickness, even when I wasn't. I worked long hours, and Julia admitted she sometimes felt more comfortable talking to Mark because he got her. I told myself that was okay. I told myself trust was everything. Now, standing outside this hotel room, I'm not so sure anymore. The line between friend and something more is blurring, and I don't know if I'm losing Julia or if she ever really belonged to me at all. It started with a message I never expected to see. A photo from Julia's phone, sent accidentally, or so she claimed, showing her and Mark together in a hotel lobby. Casual at first glance, but the caption was what shook me, waiting for the night to end. I stared at that message for what felt like hours, heart sinking deeper with every passing second. Julia had been telling me she was home all night, resting, taking care of herself and our unborn child. But this photo told a different story, one that I wasn't prepared to face. The next morning, I confronted her. I wanted to believe it was innocent. Maybe they were stuck waiting for a delayed meeting. Maybe it was just a late-night brainstorming session that turned into an accidental stay. But the way she looked at me, eyes flickering between guilt and defiance, made me doubt every explanation she gave. Now, she admitted she knew she was pregnant when she went to that hotel. I needed someone to talk to, she said, voice breaking. Mark understands me in ways you don't. That hit harder than any betrayal could. The man I trusted to be her closest friend became a wedge between us, and the fact that Julia chose him over me in that moment was devastating. I felt like I was losing her, piece by piece, and worse, losing the future we dreamed of together. The pregnancy, instead of bringing us closer, had highlighted the cracks I never wanted to see. That night wasn't just a mistake, it was a turning point. I spent the next few days haunted by questions. What were they really doing in that hotel room? Was it just a conversation or something more? Why didn't she tell me? And most painfully, was our marriage strong enough to survive this? The foundation of trust we built was crumbling beneath my feet, and standing at that crossroads, I realized this was no longer just about jealousy or hurt. It was about deciding who Julia really was and who I was willing to be in the face of this betrayal. After that night, everything changed between Julia and me. The silence that filled our apartment was thicker than any argument. She was there physically, but emotionally, she felt miles away. And I was caught in a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and confusion. I wanted answers, but every time I tried to ask, she shut down or deflected. The woman who once poured her heart out to me was now a closed book. I remember one evening in particular, about a week after the hotel incident. Julia sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. The baby bump was starting to show, a quiet reminder of what we were supposed to be building together. I looked at her and asked, "Why didn't you tell me the truth that night?" She avoided my gaze. "I didn't want to worry you," she whispered. "I thought I could handle it alone." But I couldn't understand why alone meant with Mark, in a hotel room, rather than with me, her husband. Mark's presence complicated everything. He seemed to appear more often now, sometimes unannounced. I caught glimpses of him on her phone screen, casual messages filled with inside jokes and late-night conversations. I knew Julia relied on him, but I didn't know how deep their connection really was. One afternoon, I confronted her again. "Is there something between you and Mark that I don't know about?" My voice was strained, desperate for the truth. Julia sighed, tears welling in her eyes. "Mark's just a friend," she insisted. "He's helped me through tough times. I never meant to hurt you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that the line between friendship and something else had already blurred. The tension grew unbearable. I felt like a spectator in my own marriage. The woman I loved was pulling away, leaning on someone else for support, and I was left questioning everything. My worth, my role in her life, even the love that once felt unbreakable. At work, I found it hard to concentrate. My colleagues noticed the change. David, a trusted friend and coworker, pulled me aside one day. "You okay, man? You seem distracted." I forced a smile. "Just some personal stuff." He nodded, but I could tell he wanted more. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the ache in my chest, but I opened up a little. "My wife's been distant. There's someone else, or maybe something else. I don't know." David listened carefully. "Sounds rough. You need to figure out what you want before it gets worse." His words stuck with me. Was I holding on to something that was already gone? Or was there still hope to salvage what Julia and I had? One evening, Julia and I tried to talk. I wanted to bridge the growing gap between us, to understand her fears and share mine. But the conversation quickly spiraled into accusations and tears. She accused me of not trusting her. I accused her of hiding too much. The night ended with her retreating to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Days passed like that, cold, distant, empty. I felt like I was losing her to a secret I couldn't fully grasp. Then came the moment that shook me even more. I overheard a phone call between Julia and Mark. The words weren't just friendly, they were intimate, full of longing and regret. My heart shattered. I realized that the hotel night was only the beginning. There was a deeper story, one Julia wasn't ready to tell me yet. I wanted to confront them both, to demand the truth. But a part of me feared what I might find. Would I be able to forgive? Could I even face the woman I loved if she had already chosen someone else? The pregnancy, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a fragile thread holding together a crumbling world. I stood on the edge, unsure whether to step back or leap forward into the unknown. My marriage was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure if it would snap or hold. The night I found the hotel key card tucked away in Julia's jacket pocket is etched into my memory like a scar. It wasn't just the card itself. It was the realization that she hadn't just spent the night there. She had stayed deliberately more than once. The truth I'd been avoiding hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a one-time mistake or an innocent conversation. It was something ongoing. I confronted Julia with the card, voice shaking, barely able to hold back the storm inside me. She didn't deny it. Instead, she confessed that the nights with Mark were her way of coping, with the pregnancy, with me, with herself. She said she felt alone, misunderstood, and scared, that the weight of carrying our child while feeling this distance from me had pushed her into Mark's arms, not physically but emotionally. This changed everything. Up until that moment, I had been consumed by jealousy and suspicion, imagining the worst. But now I saw a different picture, one where Julia was drowning, desperate for support, and I wasn't there for her the way she needed. Mark wasn't just a rival, he was a lifeline. I realized the conflict wasn't just about betrayal, it was about loneliness, fear, and unspoken pain on both sides. Julia's silence wasn't cruelty, it was a cry for help. And my anger was a wall blocking the chance to understand what she really needed. For the first time, I questioned my own role in the breakdown of our marriage. Had I been too wrapped up in my own world to see her struggle? Was I holding on to the past instead of facing the complicated reality? That night, the path forward became clearer. It wasn't just about uncovering lies. It was about confronting the pain and fear that had built between us. And whether we could rebuild or fall apart depended on what came next. The days after the hotel keycard revelation felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. Julia and I were forced into conversations we'd both avoided, confronting emotions we hadn't been brave enough to face. But the truth didn't make things easier. It only made the cracks in our marriage wider and more raw. Julia began to open up about how isolated she felt during the pregnancy, despite my presence. She confessed that the nausea, fatigue, and mood swings had overwhelmed her, and she'd felt like I was more invested in the idea of the baby than in her as a person. I needed someone to listen without judgment, she said quietly. Mark was there when you weren't. Her words stabbed me deeply. I had been absent, yes, but was I really so blind? Mark's role became clearer in these painful talks. He wasn't just a friend, he was a confidant who had become entwined in Julia's emotional world. She told me how Mark had shown up during nights when the fear and loneliness were unbearable. But Julia swore that nothing physical had happened. No betrayal beyond the emotional connection. I wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered like a shadow. Still, the emotional weight between us thickened. Every time I looked at Julia, I saw both the woman I loved and a stranger I was losing. The baby bump grew, but so did the distance. We were tethered together by promises and history, but drifting apart in ways that felt irreversible. At work, my mind was fractured. David noticed my distraction and offered support, but I felt isolated. I struggled to separate my personal pain from professional responsibilities, and my work began to suffer. I avoided Mark whenever I could, but the tension was palpable when we crossed paths. Mark was polite, even distant, as if he knew he had crossed a boundary, but wasn't sure how to fix it. One afternoon, Julia and I tried counseling, an attempt to salvage what remained. Sitting in that sterile office, the therapist urged us to speak honestly. Julia broke down, admitting how scared she was of losing me and the child we were expecting. She admitted to emotional dependence on Mark, but emphasized she wanted to repair our marriage. I confessed my own failings, the nights I worked late to avoid coming home, the silent resentment I'd harbored. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months, but the wounds were too fresh to heal instantly. Then came the hardest moment. Julia revealed that Mark had confessed to her feelings, not just friendship, something deeper. She hadn't known how to respond and feared what that might mean for her and me. That confession shattered the fragile trust I was trying to rebuild. The man I once considered a friend had crossed an emotional line, and Julia was caught in the middle. I asked Julia if she still cared for Mark. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I don't know." The uncertainty was a poison I couldn't swallow. Days turned into weeks of cold mornings and tense evenings. We went through the motions of life, but the heart of our marriage was broken. Julia's mood swings grew sharper. The pregnancy hormones compounded with guilt and fear. I tried to be patient, to give her space, but every silence screamed volumes. One night, after a particularly sharp argument about trust, Julia packed a bag. She told me she needed time alone to think, to figure out what she truly wanted. I felt the ground shift beneath me as she walked out the door, the weight of our fractured relationship heavier than ever. Left alone, I confronted my own demons. I realized I had been so focused on Julia's betrayal and Mark's intrusion that I hadn't fully acknowledged my own failings. The emotional distance wasn't one-sided. I had retreated, afraid to face the responsibility of becoming a father, afraid to support Julia in the way she needed. I reached out to David, admitting I was struggling. His steady presence became a lifeline as I navigated the pain and confusion. He reminded me that forgiveness and healing were possible, but required honest work, both with Julia and myself. Meanwhile, Julia's silence became deafening. We exchanged only essential messages about appointments and the baby's health. I missed her fiercely, but didn't know how to bridge the gap without risking more pain. Then unexpectedly, Julia called. Her voice was fragile. She said she wanted to come home, to try again, but she warned that things wouldn't be the same, that the trust was broken and would take time to mend. When she returned, the house felt different, quiet, cautious, fragile. We walked on eggshells around each other, trying to find new ways to connect without pushing too hard. There were moments of tenderness, her hand on my arm, a shared smile, but the shadow of Mark lingered between us. Julia confided that Mark had distanced himself after their confession, respecting her choice but clearly hurt. I couldn't tell if I felt relief or bitterness. It was a complicated mix of emotions, anger, jealousy, sadness, and hope, all tangled together. We began couples therapy again, this time with a clearer goal: to rebuild trust and understand the deeper issues that had driven us apart. We talked about fear, fear of abandonment, fear of change, fear of failing as partners and parents. I learned to listen without judgment, to acknowledge Julia's pain without defensiveness. Julia began to open up more about her insecurities and how the pregnancy had magnified them. We both acknowledged the mistakes we'd made, the silences, the secrets, the emotional distance. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like progress, others felt like setbacks. But beneath the struggle, I sensed a fragile hope, a chance to rewrite our story. Yet the question that haunted me daily remained: could love survive this tangled web of betrayal, fear, and broken trust? And if it did, what kind of marriage would emerge from the ashes? The night of the confrontation came unannounced, but with a force I could no longer avoid. Julia and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows over the remnants of dinner we barely touched. The house felt suffocating, every creak and silence a reminder of the fragile line we were balancing on. "I can't keep pretending this is okay," I said, my voice low but steady. "I need to know everything, Julia. No more half-truths or excuses." She looked at me, her eyes swollen from tears, but definitely raw. "You want the truth? Fine. Mark and we were more than friends that night. Not just once, but more than once. And it wasn't just emotional. I didn't tell you because I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of what I was doing." Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. The betrayal wasn't just about secrets anymore. It was about the boundaries we'd crossed, the promises shattered. I struggled to breathe as my world crumbled around me. "Why?" I choked out. "Why him? Why not me?" Julia's gaze faltered. "Because you weren't there." "Not really. I was pregnant, overwhelmed, and you were distant. I felt invisible, like I was carrying this alone. Mark was there when you turned away. He listened, held my hand. He made me feel seen." I wanted to scream, to blame her, to break something in my hands, but all I could do was sink into my chair, overwhelmed by anger, grief, and a crushing loneliness. The man I trusted as a friend had become a rival, and the woman I loved was slipping through my fingers. "But what about us?" I whispered, voice breaking. "What about our vows, our future?" Julia's eyes filled with tears again. "I wanted to hold on to us, but I was drowning. I didn't know how to ask for help, and when Mark showed up, I grabbed at any lifeline." Silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. I realized then that our marriage had been unraveling for months, maybe years, with each of us retreating into shadows instead of fighting together. I need to know if you want to save this, I said finally, voice firmer now, because I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one trying. She nodded slowly. I want to save us, but I don't know if love is enough anymore. The raw honesty broke something open inside me. I saw Julia not as a traitor, but as a frightened woman trying to survive an impossible situation. And maybe I wasn't the hero or the villain, just two flawed people caught in a painful, messy fight. Then in the quiet, the phone buzzed on the counter. Julia picked it up, her face paling. It's Mark, she said. He wants to talk. I felt a surge of anger, but also curiosity. What does he want now? Julia hesitated. Closure, maybe, or to say goodbye. I don't know. Against my better judgment, I told her, let him come over. We need to clear the air once and for all. When Mark arrived, the tension in the room was electric. He looked uncomfortable but determined. The three of us sat down, and the conversation was raw, painful, but necessary. Mark apologized for crossing lines, for the confusion, for hurting me. Julia and I listened, sometimes agreeing, sometimes clenching fists in silence. It was a brutal reckoning of all the emotions tangled between us. Mark's presence forced us to face the wounds that had festered in the dark. He admitted feelings for Julia, but accepted that she belonged with me, if I could forgive them both. Julia reached out, took my hand, and whispered, I'm sorry for everything. I squeezed her hand back, knowing forgiveness wouldn't come easy or fast. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope that we could rebuild from the ruins. That night, as Mark left, Julia and I sat together, exhausted but somehow closer. We didn't have all the answers, but we had started to break down the walls between us. I realized that the road ahead would be long and uncertain, filled with hard choices and painful truths. But if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that love, messy, complicated, flawed, was still there, struggling to survive. The days that followed our confrontation were a fragile dance of healing and uncertainty. Julie and I both knew that forgiveness wouldn't erase the past, but it offered a pathway forward. However narrow and difficult, we began rebuilding, step by cautious step, learning to trust each other again. Counseling became a weekly commitment, not just for us as a couple, but individually as well. Julia confronted the fears and loneliness that had pushed her toward Mark's comfort, while I faced my own shortcomings. The emotional distance I'd allowed to grow, and the ways I'd failed to truly be present. It wasn't easy admitting our faults. It often felt like tearing open old wounds. But through that pain, something new began to take shape. Julia's pregnancy progressed, and the tiny life growing inside her became both a symbol of hope and a reminder of the responsibility we shared. We attended prenatal classes together, talked late into the night about the kind of parents we wanted to be, and found solace in those moments where the future felt less uncertain. I watched Julia with a new appreciation, the strength she showed despite the turmoil, the way she cared for the baby even when her own heart felt fractured. She wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but we were both committed to trying, to heal. Mark eventually faded from our lives, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Julia and I agreed to keep boundaries firm, understanding that some wounds are too deep to risk reopening. The emotional entanglement with Mark became a painful but pivotal lesson, a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how easily lines can blur when pain goes unspoken. Reflecting back, I realized the complexity of love, how it can hurt, confuse, and challenge us in ways we never expected. The line between love and obsession, between loyalty and betrayal, is often blurred by fear and unmet needs. Julia's actions, while devastating, came from a place of desperation, not cruelty. And my own failures, my silence and distance, had contributed to the collapse just as much as her choices. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment of grace, but a series of conscious decisions to accept, to understand, and to move forward despite the scars. I learned that love doesn't always look like the fairy tale we imagine. Sometimes it's raw, complicated, and messy, but it's also resilient. Our marriage wasn't the same as before, and perhaps it never would be. But it had become something stronger, a partnership forged through adversity and honesty. We promised each other that we would keep talking, keep listening, and keep choosing each other every day. The pregnancy culminated in the birth of our daughter, a fragile but fierce little life who carried both our hopes and our imperfections. Holding her for the first time, I felt an overwhelming mix of love, guilt, and determination. She was a new beginning, a chance to write a different story, one of healing and growth. I also recognized how much I had grown through the pain. I was more aware now of the emotional needs beneath the surface, the importance of presence over perfection, and the necessity of vulnerability in building true intimacy. Looking back on the nightmare of betrayal and doubt, I understood that love's greatest test isn't perfection, but endurance. It's not about never breaking, but about how we come back together, piece by piece. Julie and I were far from perfect, but we were together, and that made all the difference. When I first discovered Julia had spent the night at a hotel with Mark while she was pregnant, my world shattered in ways I never imagined. The shock, the betrayal, it felt like I was drowning in a sea of confusion and anger, unable to find solid ground. Yet now, months later, I realized that moment was not just an end, but a beginning. That painful night forced us to confront truths we had long avoided, the cracks in our marriage, the loneliness behind our smiles, and the unmet needs that festered in silence. It stripped away illusions and laid bare the raw, complicated reality of who we were as individuals and as partners. Looking back, I see how fragile love can be, but also how resilient. Julie and I didn't have a perfect story. We stumbled, we hurt each other deeply, and we almost lost everything. But through the darkest moments, we found a way to hold on, not by forgetting or pretending, but by facing the pain together. Our journey wasn't about fixing what was broken, but learning to live with the imperfections and choosing each other despite them. It was about understanding that love isn't just a feeling. It's a decision made every day, often in the face of doubt and fear. Now, as I watch Julia cradle our daughter, I feel a quiet hope I never thought possible in that early chaos. Our past won't disappear, but it no longer controls us. Instead, it teaches us to be more honest, more present, and more forgiving. In the end, the night at that hotel wasn't just a betrayal, it was a catalyst. It forced us to grow, to change, and ultimately to rediscover what it truly means to love. And maybe that is the hardest, most beautiful lesson of all.